All right, so we're in the week of October 12th through the 15th, covering the endocrine system. End of the week, you've got exam 3 over chapter 7 and 8. So I posted in the modules. You look here in week 9, there's exam. Let's see, and you're not able to see that yet. Up here. But in the modules, right there at the top of week 9, says exam 3 review. Okay, so click here. So if you click that, it'll take you to this page. Tells you here's some medical conditions you need to know related to special senses. Okay, divisions of the central nervous system that you need to know. Characteristics and functions of parts of the nervous system. The hypothalamus, cerebrum, cerebellum, medulla oblongata, pons, thalamus, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, resting membrane potential. Things like, you know, cells related to the nervous system, neurons and parts of neurons, neuroglia, types of neuroglia, different types of neurons. For special senses, you need to know the function for basically of the, what does vision do? You need to be able to articulate that. Know about the optic disc, the pupil, the iris, and the foveus centralis. You need to know, and here you need to really know like where they are and what they do. You need to know the function of olfaction or smell, function of gustation or taste, hearing. You need to know the function. Also, you need to know about these structures. Okay, so try to cut down to what I thought would help you spend, you know, the best use of your time. So just wanted you to see that. That'll help you out tremendously. Like I said, I'm not going to tell you exactly what's going to be on it, but this will at least give you a way to kind of really focus. Okay, so wanted you to know that's available to you. All right, so now we're going to go into chapter 10. So, and on that review, I didn't really cover a lot on structure of the eye, but I'm doing that today in lab, so you'll have a lot of that. So just look over that as well. All right. So endocrine glands, okay? So let's start there. So endocrine system is made up of glands, and they are ductless, which means they have no ducts. So remember in the integumentary system, we learned about sweat glands. Anybody remember sweat glands? Sweat glands had ducts, right? And those ducts allowed the sweat to get up to the surface of your skin, right? Well, endocrine glands are ductless. So the sweat gland is exocrine. The endocrine glands are ductless, okay? No ducts. And what do? They secrete hormones. Secrete's another word for release. And these are chemical signals, and they influence things like homeostasis, growth and development, and metabolism. Okay, we have different categories of hormones. You have the peptide hormones. Okay, made up of proteins, glycoproteins, modified amino acids, and the steroid hormones. So if you remember anything from the videos we watched last week, some of this should sound familiar. Okay. All right, so let's learn a little bit. This is an overview. We'll cover all these in detail, but wanted to at least show you. Okay, so here is you take a high magnification of this part of the brain, you'll see the pituitary gland here, and then up here you've got the hypothalamus. Okay. In the throat, you've got the thyroid gland, and then the little nodules on them are the parathyroid glands. Okay, just above the heart or superficial to the heart, you've got the thymus gland. Superficial to the kidneys, you have the adrenal glands. Sort of intermediate between the kidneys is the pancreas. And the reproductive system. So the testes and the ovaries are in the endocrine system and the reproductive system because they have both endocrine functions and reproductive functions. Okay, so in males have testes, females have ovaries. Right? But those are your basic endocrine gland hormone, or endocrine glands. Excuse me. All right, so I'm going to pause there and give you a minute to discuss with your partners the kind of overall function of the endocrine system as well as some common endocrine glands. You can do this at home as well. So we talked a little bit about the overall role of the endocrine system as well as some endocrine glands. Let's talk a little bit more about the function of hormones. So there's a big concept we want you to know in this chapter called the second messenger system. And what happens there, this is describing peptide hormones. And they'll bind to some receptor on a plasma membrane of a cell on that gland. And that hormone functions as a first messenger. Okay, and what it does is it activates a second messenger inside the cell. Could be cyclic AMP, adenosine monophosphate, and calcium. And that second messenger's role is to start an enzyme cascade. Okay, and that's a fancy term which means a bunch of enzymes reacting in sequence. Okay, and you get some response in the cell, changes the cell's behavior, and you end up with some end product that's going to leave the cell. So that's the second messenger system. Okay, yeah, hormone, it's a first messenger, causes a reaction inside the cell through a second messenger inside the cell, leads to a product that leaves the cell. All right, so this is kind of what it looks like inside. So here you got a capillary, which is a blood vessel, and being released from this capillary is a peptide hormone. And it's a first messenger, will bind to a receptor on the plasma membrane. Okay, binding of that hormone leads to activating an enzyme right here. And it changes ATP or energy into cyclic AMP. And it functions as a second messenger. So in a sense, this binding kicks this piece off over here to break down ATP. That sets off an enzyme cascade, okay, set of enzyme reactions. In this case, you're breaking down glycogen into glucose. Okay, and that glucose can then enter the bloodstream. So in this case, this hormone is telling the cells to increase blood sugar. Okay. All right. Now, what happens inside the cell? Okay. Now, that was more with the peptide hormones, you get the second messenger system. With the steroid hormones, which are made up of lipids, they function completely inside the cell. And they're going to diffuse across the plasma membrane. When they get in the cell, they're going to bind to receptor proteins inside the cell. So the protein-based hormones bind to receptor on the cell membrane. Steroid hormones, because they can go through the plasma membrane, will bind to receptors inside the cell. Okay? And why can they go through the membrane? Because remember, it's a phospholipid bilayer, right? So similar properties. So the hormone receptor complex then, which is again a connection where a hormone binds to a receptor, and then that's going to bind to DNA. Remember DNA? Okay, the genetic information. So what does that do? Well, it activates specific genes. And that gene activation causes production of enzymes in your cells that lead to some changes inside your cell. So again, peptide hormones do the enzyme cascades, okay? Create a product, leaves the cell. Steroid hormones influence DNA, activate particular genes, okay? And they create enzymes that do something, okay? So the steroid hormones have a role in creating the enzymes. Peptide hormones essentially just activate enzymes that are already made. Okay, does that kind of make sense? Okay, so here's a picture of it. Here's your steroid hormone, because it's a lipid, goes straight through the plasma membrane. All right, so inside the cell, hormone binds to a receptor that's inside the nucleus. Okay, it's going to go straight through this nuclear pore into the nucleus, attached to a receptor protein. This becomes a hormone receptor complex when they're connected to each other. That complex is then going to attach itself to DNA, activate a gene. And what do you know? What is DNA used to make? You got to remember? Messenger RNA, right? Transcription. Okay? So you're activating this gene to make that particular mRNA. That mRNA then leaves the nucleus, binds a ribosome, translation occurs, make protein. All right, so different way of influencing the cell, right? So you can either essentially use what's already there, or you can influence the creation of what you need to have happen. Okay, different ways of influencing what happens in the cell. Yes, so if people who take steroids, they're essentially, those steroid hormones can get to your muscles, stimulate your muscles to make the proteins that continue to build that muscle. Now, the challenge is they can go to any other cell and they can have problems with those cells.
That's why, like, if you do take steroids and don't work out, you get fat.
Well, that's one effect, that it can damage kidneys, it can damage other organs in your body as well. All right. So let's pause and you can describe the difference between the way peptide hormones work and the way lipid hormones work. You can do this at home as well. All right, so we talked a little bit about peptide hormones and about steroid hormones. Let's talk about how we control these hormones. So hormones generally are going to affect substances inside the bloodstream. And they affect how much of it's in the bloodstream, whether it's going to be higher or lower. And hormones, in a sense, I mean, the brain does a lot of control over the body, but the endocrine system does too. So a hormone in one part of the body through its, or a gland in one part of the body through its hormones can affect another organ. So what controls the release of these hormones? Could be the nervous system, could be negative feedback. Remember that? Remember negative feedback back from chapter 1? Okay, it helps you with maintaining homeostasis. Action of other hormones. Could be a combination of 2 or 3 of those. Okay? But all those can be impacting how those hormones work and how they're released. All right, so let's start going into specific endocrine glands. First one we'll talk about is the hypothalamus. So that hypothalamus is going to control secretions of your pituitary gland. Okay, which is located nearby in the brain, or in the cranial cavity. All right, so there are specialized cells there called neurosecretory cells. Neuro, nervous system, secretory, release. So they produce antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH, and another hormone called oxytocin. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland can be broken up into 2 sections. There's an anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary. We'll start with the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary serves as a storage chamber for ADH and oxytocin that were made by the hypothalamus. So let's talk more about ADH. So it gets secreted when hypothalamic neurons in your hypothalamus, are able to determine that there is too high of a concentration of salt in your blood. And causes more water to get reabsorbed into the capillaries in your kidneys. This is going to end up raising your blood pressure. It's going to constrict your blood vessels. And when you constrict your blood vessels, you essentially decrease the amount of spaces available for diffusion across the blood vessel. Okay? When the blood vessel expands, it's easier to diffuse chemicals across it. When it's constricted, it's more difficult.
So the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland kind of work together to function.
Correct. So hypothalamus makes the hormones, posterior pituitary stores them and secretes them when it's necessary. So, and we'll see that pattern play out in other areas as well. So, especially when we get to the pancreas, we'll talk about that a little bit.
So I think going back to chapter 2, like technically the hypothalamus would be like DNA, and then the pituitary gland, would that be like M?
Yeah, you could definitely make that analogy because the DNA is being used to make RNA, RNA is being used to make protein. So your hypothalamus is making your ADH and oxytocin. It's going, like the DNA is going to leave the nucleus to go to the ribosome. ADH and oxytocin are going to leave the hypothalamus and go to the posterior pituitary. And then at some point, they're going to be released out, kind of like translation. So, similar analogy. So a medical term related to this is diabetes insipidus. This happens when you don't have the ability to produce ADH. So if you think about it, if you couldn't produce it, when your salt concentration gets too high, and you're not able to, that means you're not going to be able to reabsorb water. So another word for diuretic means diuretic makes you go number one, makes you urinate. So anti-diuretic sort of prevents that. And it's reabsorbing that water and keeping your kidneys from filtering that out and going into your bladder. So if you have the inability to produce it, okay, you're going to be holding on to all that water. Or an anti-diuretic, in a sense, let me explain that a little better. So if normally ADH is going to make you reabsorb the water, failure to produce it means it's going to go into your kidneys and you're going to be just going. All right, so if you don't have enough anti-diuretic hormone, you're going to probably have a very frequent urination. Okay. Okay, so the other hormone that's stored in the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. And what it does, it promotes contractions of the uterus during childbirth. It also helps milk reach, or we call it milk letdown, but basically helps the mothers move their milk from their mammary glands so that the baby can receive it when the baby's nursing. So how is oxytocin controlled? Well, most things are controlled through negative feedback. This is one of the few that's positive feedback. And that should make sense because if you're having uterine contractions, would you want those contractions to be under negative feedback? No, because then you'd be basically in labor forever, right? You need to keep those contractions going until the baby's out. So it needs to get stronger and stronger, okay? All right, so we talked about hypothalamus and posterior pituitary. Let's talk about the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary is under the control of hypothalamic hormones, okay? So and the anterior pituitary has hormones that affect other glands. All right, so you have the thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. As the name suggests, it stimulates the thyroid. Adrenal corticotropic hormone, or ACTH, okay, is involved with the adrenal glands. Gonadotropic hormones involved with the gonads, right? The testes and ovaries. All right, and there are other hormones that are related to the anterior pituitary or are there but have functions as well, like prolactin and growth hormone. Okay, so those are other ones that you'll learn. Okay, so here's a picture of your pituitary. You can see the hypothalamus up here, posterior pituitary, anterior pituitary. Okay, so again, with the posterior pituitary, neurosecretory cells release the or make the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. The hormones move down the axons to the axon terminals, and then when it's necessary, the ADH and oxytocin get released from the axon terminals down into the bloodstream. You see how these axon terminals meet up with the capillaries? Okay, so they can release those hormones. All right, here you can see the antidiuretic hormone effects in the kidneys. Oxytocin effects in swing muscle in the uterus. Oxytocin effects in the mammary glands. All right, for the anterior pituitary, here the neurosecretory cells are going to produce hormones that basically make those hypothalamic hormones release, or they can inhibit them. So they can either promote those hypothalamic hormones or inhibit them. These hormones get secreted into what we call a portal system, another network of capillaries. And each hypothalamic hormone or type of hypothalamic hormone can stimulate production or inhibit production and secretion of some anterior pituitary hormone. So the ADH and oxytocin can have some role in inhibiting or stimulating the hormones of the anterior pituitary. And that anterior pituitary then is going to secrete its hormones into the bloodstream. And they'll go to certain tissues, cells, and glands throughout the body. For example, thyroid stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid gland. Adrenal corticotropic hormone goes to the adrenal cortex. All right. Prolactin goes to the mammary glands. Growth hormone affects the bones and tissues, like muscle. And ovaries and testes are affected by the gonadotropic hormones, FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. Okay. So the ones that, so the test on Friday is over nervous system and special senses. So this will be on the next test, okay? So, you're gonna have to know this later. So you will have to know them for an exam, just not the next one yet. All right, so we talked a little bit about these anterior pituitary glands. Let's start with one of those hormones from the anterior pituitary, the growth hormone. So as the name suggests, it influences growth. It can affect a person's height. So if a person has pituitary dwarfism, it happens when they have too little growth hormone produced during childhood. And if they have too much growth hormone produced during childhood, that person can turn out to be a giant. Another medical condition, it's acromegaly. So when you get too much growth hormone, that's secreted during adulthood. Okay, so it's a little different case of what's going to happen with growth hormone there. So in growth hormone, remember, or in adulthood, remember we learned about bones. The epiphyseal plates are generally closed in adulthood. Okay, so it's going to have a little different effect. But they can maybe don't increase as much in diameter or length, but they can increase more in diameter. So basically or width. Basically, they're not growing longer, but the bones are growing wider. All right, so okay, since I think we've covered the pituitary and the hypothalamus, let's go on to the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland. Start with the thyroid. We have thyroid hormone, obviously, produced by the thyroid. Yeah, it comes in two forms. Could be T3 with 3 iodine ions or atoms in it, 3 iodine atoms. T4 has 4 iodine atoms. Okay. You can actually if you break these words down, they're not that bad. T3 is triiodothyronine. Okay, triiodothyronine. And then T4 is thyroxine. So what are the effects of this thyroid hormone? Well, it can increase your metabolic rate, okay? Increase the rate of those chemical reactions in your body. And its effects are all over the body, okay? It's not specific to one area. Okay, so here's a medical implication, the goiter. So remember how we said that T3 and T4 had iodine atoms in them? So if you have a lack of iodine in the diet, and a lack of iodine in your bloodstream, the person can get a goiter. And then the thyroid gland is going to enlarge. And that's going to be because it's being constantly stimulated by the anterior pituitary. So in a sense, this is the thyroid gland is kind of acting like a muscle. So because it's not making much, so since your body doesn't have a lot of iodine, it has to work really, really hard to make T3 and T4. And it compensates by becoming larger in order to make the amount of T3 and T4 you need with limited resources. Okay.
You start taking iodine pills.
It can in some cases. So for some people, they may have to have like, a medical procedure, but generally speaking, it usually over time with iodine, whether it's a tablet or some other treatment or pill, it can decrease in size. All right, more medical conditions. So congenital hypothyroidism. So what does hypo mean? Anybody remember? Hypo rhymes with low, so this is lower. Okay, so hypothyroidism, and when you say it means it's under secretion of thyroid hormone. And when you say congenital, this means that this happens this is a problem from development. Okay, so thyroid's not developing properly. It leads to low secretion of thyroid hormone. And as a result of that, individuals are typically short and stocky. Okay. Another medical condition is mixed edema. And this is hypothyroidism in adults. And you see this, it's characterized by multiple symptoms, thick and puffy skin, slower pulse rate, lower body temperature, weight gain, lethargy or tiredness. Lethargy is another word for being tired. Okay, on the other end, we have hyperthyroidism, also known as Graves' disease. Okay? This happens when you get over secretion of thyroid hormone. Okay? And here you can get what we call an exophthalmic goiter form. Okay, and this is edema in the eye socket area. It's ophthalmic, like an ophthalmologist, someone who is a medical doctor who works on people's eyes. Okay, so that you get a goiter in the eye socket. And the muscles that move the eyes, which we'll learn about in lab, get swollen. So symptoms here are going to include things like hyperactivity, insomnia, and nervousness and irritability, which should make sense because thyroid hormone is basically involved in your metabolic rate. So if you have overstimulation of your thyroid hormone, you have a really high metabolic rate. It would make sense that you'd be hyperactive. Also, if you're getting swelling in your eye socket, it should make sense that you'd be pretty irritable, and it should make sense that you might have a hard time going to sleep. Right? So should make sense. Yes, it can be. If there's too much swelling, it could damage the muscles permanently. You could also, there's blood vessels there that could get constricted, nerves that could get constricted. And so there is definitely potential for damage. Depending on how severe it is, potentially. But more than likely, what you'd end up having is, you'd have some problem, and you'd probably end up, or that person would end up maybe having to lose the eye to, basically deal with the amount of pressure that's there. So related to the thyroid, another thyroid hormone is calcitonin. Okay. You might have heard of calcitonin when we talked about skeletal system. Okay. So calcitonin helps control your levels of calcium in your blood. It gets secreted when your blood calcium levels get too high. And it basically results in depositing of calcium in your bones. So I like to say that calcitonin tones down your blood calcium. It helps me remember its effect. So in order to lower the blood calcium levels, you have to find ways to get it out of the bloodstream. One of those ways is by taking that calcium, putting it in your bone. Okay, so we talked about the thyroid gland. Let's talk about the parathyroid gland. So with the parathyroid gland, it's on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland, so on the back side, the dorsal side. And the parathyroid gland produces parathyroid hormone, or PTH. So parathyroid gland is going to cause the level of phosphate in your blood to decrease, and your level of calcium in your blood to increase. So in that sense, it opposes calcitonin. So it promotes your bones to release their calcium, to increase the blood calcium. It promotes reabsorption of calcium by the kidneys instead of filtering it out. So if your kidneys reabsorb it back in the bloodstream, your calcium levels go up in the bloodstream. It will also activate vitamin D in your kidneys. Okay? That helps with that reabsorbing of calcium, particularly in your intestines. So all these ways are different ways you can increase your blood calcium. Medical condition related to this is hypocalcemic tetany. And this happens when you get insufficient secretion of parathyroid hormone. Okay. And so the name should kind of make sense, at least the hypocalcemic part, because if you have insufficient secretion of parathyroid hormone, that inhibits your ability to increase blood calcium levels, which means they're going to go down, which means you are hypo for calcium. Okay. All right, so here's an illustration of how calcitonin and parathyroid hormone work together to provide homeostasis for your calcium levels in your blood. All right, so if the blood calcium levels get too high, your thyroid gland is going to secrete calcitonin into the bloodstream. And it's going to make your bones take up calcium. The blood calcium level is going to go back down. If the calcium levels get too low, parathyroid glands are going to release parathyroid hormone into your blood. It's going to make your bones release their calcium, make your kidneys reabsorb the calcium in the kidneys. And it makes your kidneys activate vitamin D, which helps your intestines reabsorb the calcium from your digestive tract. Makes your blood level calcium go back up. Okay? And this interplay of these two hormones keeps your blood calcium at homeostasis. All right. So I'm going to give you all a few minutes. Talk to your partner about particularly the hormones of the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland. Also talk about calcitonin and parathyroid hormone and how they work. You can do this at home as well. Keep moving here. So you have your adrenal glands. So we talked about hypothalamus, talked about pituitary gland, talked about thyroid gland, talked about parathyroid gland. So now let's go on to the adrenal glands. So the inner portion of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal medulla. Okay, and it is under control of the nervous system. The nervous system controls it. And it secretes two hormones. You have the epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. Should make sense. Adrenal, adrenaline, and norepinephrine, or noradrenaline. This is involved in your fight or flight responses. And we talked a little bit about that in our discussion of the nervous system. Helps you deal with stress in the short term. Now, the outer portion of your adrenal gland is called the cortex. Okay? It's like a crown around the medulla. It has 3 actual layers to it, and each layer is going to produce a different set of hormones. Okay, and the adrenal cortex is actually under the control of adrenal cortical stimulating, or ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone, excuse me, adrenal corticotropic hormone. And its hormones will provide a long-term response to stress. So as opposed to the adrenal medulla, which has a short-term response to stress. All right, also provides mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids, and also you'll find the hormones of the adrenal cortex also include female sex or male sex hormones. Okay, and I just also want to make clear it says under control of ACTH. If you remember, that was one of those hormones of the anterior pituitary. Okay, so anterior pituitary here is stimulating or controlling the adrenal gland. All right. So this kind of shows this visually. So again, you have the hypothalamus sending a signal to your spinal cord, which sends a signal to the adrenal medulla. Okay, sends either epinephrine or norepinephrine. Okay, typically the response to stress in the short term is going to make your heart rate and your blood pressure go up, increase the amount of blood glucose you have, okay, and energize your muscles. Now, for the adrenal cortex, again, your neurosecretory cells produce these hypothalamic releasing hormones, so they're going to release ACTH out of the anterior pituitary. You go to the adrenal cortex, you get a long-term response. And you're going to release glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. Here, the glucocorticoids influence protein and fat metabolism rather than break down glucose or carbohydrates. Also, it helps reduce inflammation, suppresses your immune system. Because you don't necessarily want your immune system to be on high alert all the time. All right, this is more when you're relaxed. You also release mineralocorticoids. This allows sodium ions and water to get reabsorbed by your kidneys. Blood volume and blood pressure are going to increase. So your blood pressure goes down with the short-term response to stress, goes back up with the long-term response. Okay, glucocorticoids, example is cortisol. So it increases your blood glucose level. How does it do that? It can interrupt the inflammatory response. Okay, helps you release pain and swelling of the tissue. Because again, inflammation is driving resources to a certain area to heal it. When you want to counteract that, you're keeping the blood or keeping the glucose in the blood. But by basically lowering or making that inflammatory response go down, you can actually make the person susceptible to injury and infection. Because again, you're kind of disabling the immune system a little bit. Mineralocorticoids, on the other hand, example here is aldosterone. So it focuses on the kidney and it's involved in absorbing sodium and water at the kidneys, also excreting potassium. All right, maintaining your balance of sodium and potassium. And so renin-angiotensin system is actually more involved in controlling aldosterone secretion than ACTH is. All right, and this happens, it basically stimulates aldosterone secretion if your blood sodium levels get too low and your blood pressure gets too low. All right, so its function is to raise your blood pressure. How does it do that? Well, there's a hormone called angiotensin 2, and it constricts the arterioles. So if you have an arteriole, it's like a small artery. And if you constrict it, you have more pressure against the walls of that artery, right? So if anybody, like when you're watering the grass, put your thumb over the opening of the hose. What does it do? It has more pressure, makes the water come out a little bit faster, right? So if you constrict the vessel, you're increasing the pressure. Okay. All right, so aldosterone also helps your kidneys reabsorb sodium. So again, this constriction makes it harder to get the sodium or other ions out of your kidney blood vessels, but also helps them go back. Those that get into the kidney tubules, get them back into the capillaries. Okay, so what opposes this? So, usually for some reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? And you learn that in physics, but with homeostasis, you usually have some sort of opposition. And that is the atrial natriuretic hormone. And so it is antagonistic to aldosterone. So it basically does the opposite thing. It lowers your blood pressure. All right, so here's a picture of that. Let's see. All right. So if the blood sodium levels get too low, your kidneys are going to secrete renin into your blood. Renin is going to stimulate angiotensin 1 and 2. It's going to cause your adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. Aldosterone is going to make your kidneys reabsorb the sodium and water out of your kidney tubules. And that's going to make your blood pressure go up. Okay? Think about why people that eat too much salt in their food, right? Why do we tell people not to do that? Because it makes your what? Blood pressure go up, right? So when you're reabsorbing that sodium, you're increasing your blood pressure. When you reabsorb that water, you got more stuff inside the blood vessel that pushes against the wall of the blood vessel. Okay. So that's going to increase your blood pressure. So on the other hand, if your sodium levels in the blood get too low, your heart's going to secrete atrial natriuretic hormone into your blood. Okay, and sodium, the symbol for sodium is Na, so natriuretic. Okay, so your kidneys are going to excrete sodium in water into your urine. So the opposite effect. Okay, that's going to decrease your blood pressure. So the balance of these two hormones provides homeostasis. All right. So we talked about basically how the adrenal cortex works normally. Let's talk about how the adrenal cortex works abnormally. Okay. So first malfunction is Addison's disease. So here you get a hyposecretion of adrenal cortex hormones. Remember, hypo is low, so low secretion. And you get excessive ACTH, so that's still ineffective. Okay, it causes what we call bronzing of the skin. And because the glucose can't be replenished without any cortisol, individuals get susceptible to getting different infections. All right, and because they have low secretion of adrenal cortex hormones, you get lack of aldosterone. Okay, you get low blood pressure, dehydration. So Cushing syndrome, another condition. This is hypersecretion of adrenal cortex hormones, so too high secretion, which pushes you toward diabetes mellitus. Okay, you get excess aldosterone, you get hypertension. Okay, increases your blood pressure too high. All right, so some of that bronzing of the skin there with Cushing's or Addison's disease. Okay. So, all right, got some swelling here. All right, this is that. It's like diabetes mellitus here. All right, so I'll give you a minute to talk with your partner about what you learned about the adrenal gland. So that concludes part 1 of the endocrine system. We'll pick up at the pancreas in part 2.